All right, so last class we stopped at glycolysis. So again, glycolysis is occurring in the cytoplasm of any cell, and the products of glycolysis were 2 NADH, 2 pyruvates, 4 ATP, but keep in mind that 2 ATPs were required to start the process of glycolysis, so the net amount of ATP is actually 2 ATP molecules. All right, and we watched this video, the Amoeba Sisters on cellular respiration. So the next part we need to talk about is what happens to the pyruvate so that it can enter the mitochondria. So this step is called the Krebs cycle preparation. So pyruvate has to undergo another reaction before a portion of it can enter the Krebs cycle. So what happens is pyruvate loses a carbon atom in the form of carbon dioxide. The other 2 carbon atoms get bonded to a molecule called coenzyme A, or CoA. During this reaction, another NAD plus gets reduced to NADH. All right, so that is what we're seeing here. And here's that carbon dioxide being released. So during one complete cycle, a 2-carbon group gets added to the Krebs cycle, and the 2 carbon atoms get fully oxidized to carbon dioxide. And that's the waste product that we exhale when we are breathing. We are exhaling that carbon dioxide. Most of the energy released when the carbon atoms are oxidized gets transformed into a reducing power in the form of NADH, as well as another molecule called FADH2, flavinadenine dinucleotide. So this FADH2 molecule is similar to NADH, as well as it's similar to the NADPH that we saw in photosynthesis. During the Krebs cycle, an ATP molecule is also generated. All right, so here we're just seeing what is happening in the Krebs cycle. The role of the Krebs cycle is to transfer the energy that was originally stored in glucose to the reducing power of NADH, here, here, and here, as well as FADH2, which we see here. And there's that one molecule of ATP being produced as well. All right, so like we talked about, glycolysis is anaerobic, meaning it can function when there's no oxygen, but it can also function when there is oxygen present as well. So when there is oxygen present, then the products of glycolysis, they will move from the cytoplasm of the cell and into the matrix of the mitochondria. All right, so again, the products of glycolysis, the pyruvate and the NADH, they will move into the matrix of the mitochondria and become part of the Krebs cycle. Once there, the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chains, which happen inside the mitochondria, will produce ATP, carbon dioxide, and water. Pyruvate, which is a 3-carbon molecule, it loses a carbon atom by combining with that molecule called coenzyme A, and it'll form a molecule called acetyl coenzyme A, abbreviated to acetyl-CoA, as well as carbon dioxide. So now acetyl-CoA, it's a 2-carbon molecule. It will combine with a 4-carbon molecule when it enters the Krebs cycle, and it'll form a 6-carbon molecule. That molecule is oxidized, and during that process, carbon dioxide, NADH, FADH2, and ATP are formed. The ATP then is used by cells for energy. The NADH and FADH2 provide reducing power for the next part, which is the electron transport chain, and then the CO2 gas will be released as a waste product of the Krebs cycle. All right, so next is the electron transport. So majority of the ATP molecules in aerobic cellular respiration are produced during this process, the electron transport. It's very similar to what we saw in photosynthesis when we saw the electron transport chain happening in chloroplasts. So high energy electrons are passed to a chain of electron carrying molecules that are attached to the inner membrane of the mitochondria. So right here is the inner membrane, outer membrane is here, and then here is the matrix, and these folded areas are called the cristae. So as the electrons get passed from one carrier to another, energy is released in small controlled amounts. That energy is used to pump hydrogen ions across the membrane from the matrix to the intermembrane space right here. That's that space between the inner and outer membranes of the mitochondria. So just like in photosynthesis, there's a buildup of ions in the intermembrane space. It creates a hydrogen ion concentration gradient. The ions can then diffuse back across the membrane, but only through these special channels created by the enzyme ATP synthase. This enzyme uses the energy of the concentration gradient to bind a phosphate group to ADP and will form ATP. And that process is called chemiosmosis. It's the movement of hydrogen ions down their concentration gradient and synthesizing ATP from the ADP and phosphate. The final electron acceptor is oxygen in the electron transport system. The oxygen will accept the electrons and the hydrogen ions, and then the resulting molecule is water. All right, so just a quick summary of what's happening. So the oxidation of NADH and FADH2 creates a proton gradient that powers the ATP synthase, which is called chemiosmosis. It's similar to the chemiosmosis we saw in photosynthesis. It's the movement of hydrogen ions down a concentration gradient. Oxygen is the final electron acceptor. If there was no oxygen, the NADH and FADH2 will stay in their reduced state, and they wouldn't be available for the Krebs cycle. All right, so just in summary here, step 1 was glycolysis. It occurred in the cytoplasm. Glucose gets broken down into 2 pyruvates, and then 2 ATPs were also made. Step 2, the pyruvate becomes acetyl-CoA. That still occurs in the cytoplasm. Plus there's a carbon dioxide as well being released. Step 3, it's the Krebs cycle. It's also called the citric acid cycle. Now this is occurring in the mitochondria. The acetyl-CoA will enter the Krebs cycle, and we see the formation of ATP, carbon dioxide, and NADH, as well as FADH2. During the electron transport chain, this is also occurring in the mitochondria. Electrons are moving down their electron transport chain, and then electrons at the end get caught by oxygen to make water. And the final amount of ATP that are made is about 32 ATP molecules. These will then be used for energy. All right, just some quick questions here. What compound derived from glucose actually enters the Krebs cycle? That was the acetyl-CoA. That's the compound that is prepared before it enters the Krebs cycle in the mitochondria. The majority of the ATP for glucose is formed in the electron transport chain. That's what we saw. We saw about 32 molecules of ATP. What is the purpose of the Krebs cycle in relation to ATP production? So the Krebs cycle is very important because it produces the reducing power, NADH and FADH2, for the electron transport chain. Question 3. The carbon atoms derived from glucose are fully oxidized in the Krebs cycle? What is reduced in the Krebs cycle? So we saw that the NAD plus and the FAD get reduced to NADH and FADH2. And lastly, how does the word catabolism apply to the Krebs cycle? So catabolism is when there's a breakdown of large molecules. So what's happening in this case is glucose gets broken down into pyruvate during glycolysis. Then it gets broken down into 2-carbon molecule before it's used in the Krebs cycle. So the 6-carbon molecule is oxidized several times to produce a 4-carbon molecule at the end of this cycle. All right, just a few more questions. The glycolysis occurs in the multiple choice. It occurs in the cytoplasm. The inner membrane of the mitochondrion is folded in order to, anytime we see membranes being folded, it's to increase the surface area. In this case, for electron transport. Question 3, which process breaks down pyruvate molecules into carbon dioxide and acetyl-CoA? So that was before the Krebs cycle, so it was during the Krebs cycle preparation. The process that begins with glucose and produces 2 pyruvate molecules and 2 ATP molecules, that is in glycolysis. Number 5, the component of cellular respiration that directly requires oxygen, that is the electron transport system or the electron transport chain, as we saw that last electron acceptor was oxygen. And number 6, the Krebs cycle produces 2 carbon dioxide molecules per turn. The carbon loses electrons to oxygen as carbon dioxide is formed. So during the Krebs cycle, carbon is getting oxidized. So remember that acronym, LEO, the tiger says GR. Loss of electrons is oxidation. Gain of electrons is reduction. All right, so in summary then, the ATP totals for aerobic respiration, there was 2 ATP formed during glycolysis, 2 ATP were formed during the Krebs cycle, and then 32 ATPs were formed from the electron transport chain. So from one glucose molecule, we got 36 ATP during cellular respiration. All right, just again, oxygen is required in aerobic respiration. It's the final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain. That chain was located in the inner membrane of the mitochondrial matrix. Oxygen will accept electrons from the oxidized glucose, and then it combines with hydrogen molecules to produce water. When oxygen is present, 36 molecules of ATP are produced, compared to only 2 molecules of ATP during anaerobic respiration. All right, and then down here, this paragraph is again just summarizing that glycolysis produced 2 ATPs, the Krebs cycle produced 2 ATPs, and then the electron transport chain made 32 ATPs. All right, and then all that ATP will then be used for cells, for energy to fuel all our daily activities, active transport, muscle contraction, biochemical synthesis. All right, so we'll pause here, and next class we're going to look at anaerobic cellular respiration that is occurring when oxygen is not present. So we're going to stop here and we'll watch this video.